to discuss these stories are journalist Varashini Pillai and Professor of Law and Politics at Temple University, Susan Sullivan. Ladies, good to have you with me. So we're starting with the US presidential elections and early voting starting in Atlanta. Massive queues at the polling stations. And Susan, some people waiting 10 hours to cast their ballot. That is an incredible length of time to wait to vote.
It is people waiting, showing up to vote the early hours of the morning. And as you say, standing there 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 hours. But what I think is interesting is the way this is touted in the United States versus the way we see it in other parts of the world. The spin in the United States is, this is very inspirational. This is democracy at work. And there certainly is a large measure of that. But I think also what's going on here is having to stand in line for 10 or 11 hours is off-putting, and to an extent that is hindering people's ability to participate in this democratic process because people have jobs, people have children, it's hot, it's raining. So it is incredible that they're having to do this, but I think it's not necessarily as kind of inspirational as they tend to think it is in the United States.
Yeah, and apparently some people gave up and went away because it was just taking so long. Varashini, would you wait that long for the privilege of voting?
Well, what's amazing, Shuli, is that this reminds me of my country's first democratic election in 1994, when our electoral systems were simply not prepared for the turnout because democracy happened after apartheid here in South Africa. It kind of seems to me like very bizarre, I think to a lot of the rest of the world, that the country seems surprised by the high turnout. You would hope that your country's registered voters would turn out to vote. But the US has one of the lowest voter registration populations in the developed world. Only 56% of the US voting age population cast ballots in the last 2016 election. So they have a traditionally very low registered voting turnout. So I think it's really sad that people were waiting for 10 hours, up to 10 hours in line, in what is turning out to be a historic election. You want to make it as easy as possible for people to vote and not to deter them in any way.
Is that right, Susan, that turnout tends to be quite low in the US presidential elections?
Absolutely. That's absolutely correct. It's really a disgrace when you think about how people fought and died, to earn that right. And in fact, in Georgia, a very large percentage of the early voters were members of the Black community and who were there in part in homage to John Lewis, a Black congressman who is respected and loved, who was an integral part of the civil rights movement. And people are saying in Georgia, look, they fought so hard for our right to vote. We're going to be here, even if we have to wait 10 hours.
Let's move on to Thailand. Now, here we've seen protests against the current king and the government. Varashini, this is unprecedented, really, because these kind of protests against the monarchy have only really been happening very, very recently. It was just not the done thing in Thailand to protest against the king.
Absolutely not. And I'm so glad that you introduced that, because as anybody who's been to Thailand, as I have been, the one thing is to not insult the monarchy, not just because it was law, but for the previous king, he was so beloved. He came to really embody what the Thai people saw as the best of themselves. They saw him as almost divine. However, that allegiance and love does not extend to his son, who is seen as somewhat of a playboy. And all this was made worse by the fact that the wealth of Thai in 2018, which has really spurred some of the distrust and the current change of attitude, especially from young people, towards this long-revered monarchy. So this is quite a startling turn of events in Thailand. I mean, of course, we've seen many coups, many military changes and pushback against the government, but against the head of state and the monarchy, we haven't seen this till now in perhaps 100 years.
Susan, I don't know if you're familiar with what the new king of Thailand has been up to, but he doesn't spend a lot of time in Thailand. He's actually been living it up, the sort of party lifestyle. Varashni politely called him a playboy. He's actually been hanging out with lots and lots of different women in luxury in Germany. I think we're probably more used to a rather more staid and prim and proper royal family in this country. But does it surprise you that the young, in particular, are now coming out against those sort of traditions of the monarchy and the government that they want to change as well?
Not at all. I don't think it's surprising at all. I mean, not only are we seeing this all around the world, but it was reported that these young people were making the three-finger salute from the movie The Hunger Games. I mean, this is a movie that came out in 2010. It was a young adult movie. These were young adults. They've seen this. This is the entertainment world that they're a part of, and so it doesn't surprise me that this generation is standing up and raising their fingers and saying, we're not going to accept this authority. We're going to stand in defiance. So I think these young people are trying to emulate the world that they've grown up in, essentially.
Let's move on to the UK. Now, a story coming to us from Liverpool. Police were forced to disperse large crowds in Liverpool just hours before new COVID-19 restrictions came into force. And Susan, I'll start with you. Because the Liverpool mayor is saying this shames our city. You know, I sort of feel it kind of shames the whole of the UK. And isn't it rather self-destructive? I mean, the whole point of the new measures is to impose rigorous social distancing. And yet we have young people going out on the streets, drinking and partying in defiance of that.
Well, I think the mayor is right that it is a shame on the city, and as you say, reflective of the entire population, because we're not just putting ourselves at risk, but putting the police at risk, and putting, of course, health workers at risk. So, yeah, going out and partying like this. But I think to an extent the government has to take some responsibility here. I think when you announce measures that are going to be taken, that are going to start in a week or start in 2 weeks, you undermine the urgency of the situation. So I think it's important that the real urgency is stressed and not just the possible risk factor here.
Yeah, and Varashni, I know that South Africa had one of the toughest lockdown regimes of all. So when it came out of that in September, there must have been a lot of relief. Do you have the same problem over there with young people, it being more difficult to make them adhere to the social distancing and the restrictions?
Well, as you mentioned, we had a very strict lockdown, and we've recently come out of our own level system. You guys have a 3-tiered system. We had a 4-tiered system, and we're now at the lowest tier. So I can see how a second wave would make some citizens, especially young ones who don't feel like they're particularly vulnerable, angry. But for them to party and to attack police is incredibly insensitive in a city where hospital beds are completely overwhelmed. And it is a sad thing to see. But in a sense, it is a failure of the larger political system. Really, what should have happened was a better test and tracing system in the UK to prevent the second wave that we're seeing. A second wave in the UK that the Financial Times has noted is much bigger than the rest of Europe, or rather in Europe now that Brexit is happening. So it's really sad to see that the second wave has engulfed the north of the UK, particularly cities like Liverpool, where people are frustrated and they are protesting. And the political fallout is going to be pretty big for Mr. Boris himself. His approval ratings have plummeted since April, when they were above 60%, and now they're over 30%.
Yeah, and well, he's been accused of ignoring the advice of his own scientists. There's been all these leaked reports about scientists proposing a national lockdown a couple of weeks ago. What do you think about that, Susan? I mean, I sort of get why he's resisting a national lockdown, because of the damage to the economy. But then the government have been saying all along, we are following the science. And clearly, in this case, they're not.
I think you're absolutely right. They haven't really been following the science. I think there's been tremendous reluctance because there is this pushback about the economy. But you have to take a stand. President Macron today has essentially shut down Paris between 9 in the evening and 6 in the morning. That is not a popular thing to do, but you have to take a stand. This is a national health, a world health crisis, and especially when you have young people who are essentially out in the streets, partying, putting everybody at risk. And I do think that's important. I do think that there's been miscommunication from the government. Wear a mask to protect other people. I think people are out partying in the streets without their masks, thinking, I'm going to take that risk. I mean, it's a bit like drunk driving. You can go out and you can drive when you're over the limit because you think you have judgment and you can take that risk. But in fact, it's everybody else that you're putting at risk. So I think that needs mixed messages about that too at the outset.
Absolutely. And of course, we seem to be seeing this division between the north of the country and the south of the country. Let's move rather further afield to the other side of the world, the Great Barrier Reef, which has lost half of its corals since 1995. Now, I've been to the Great Barrier Reef, I've dived it, I've seen it. So beautiful, and it is really distressing to me that here we have yet another victim of climate change. What do you make of this story, Varashni?
Well, I have to say I'm really jealous, Shuli, that you managed to go to the Great Barrier Reef, and I hope you did it a good few years ago. I also scuba dive myself, and I think for anyone who loves the ocean or just loves nature, it's devastating to hear that half of the Great Barrier Reef has been lost in the last few decades. I mean, that is a tremendously rapid rate. But I think the larger issue here is, how is Australia responding? This is their great natural wonder, right? But similar to the previous bushfires that happened in Australia, there seems to be a reluctance from its government to really come to terms with climate change. In fact, the Climate Change Performance Index has ranked Australia last out of 57 countries responsible for more than 90% of greenhouse gas emissions on climate policy. This is a country with a conservative government who has moved very slowly on reducing their emissions, who have cut funding, who've really not been very enthusiastic in this fight, and yet their resources are the ones being affected by this crisis.
Yeah, and with the Great Barrier Reef, I mean, you can see exactly what's happening. These corals are turning white, their algae that is leaving them, they're bleaching, and then they're dying. And Susan, it takes so long for coral to return, to regenerate.
Well, it does. It takes decades to regenerate, but it doesn't take very long for it to, as you say, to bleach out. And as the surface of the ocean continues to heat up because of climate change, it's just going to keep happening exponentially. And as you say, this is about the science. It's the same kind of science that is really being rejected or not being believed by the people who have some authority to do something about this. So again, you have to accept the science. You have to accept the problem, because you can't begin to remediate it. And this has, the loss of the coral reef is, we've all, I have not had the opportunity to dive there, but it is so beautiful. We've all seen that vibrancy and seen that color. But this is going to, excuse the pun, have a ripple effect on the biodiversity and the ecosystem. So, it really is a really pressing issue. And it's great that people pay attention.
I was going to say, the figures show, the UN says that if temperatures rise by another 0.5 Celsius, then 90% of those corals could be lost. Varashni and Susan, thank you very much indeed for joining me here on this edition of Behind the Headlines.